Hello and welcome to Individual Differences, Biological Explanations for OCD. What we're going to look at in this session is what are the biological explanations for the development and onset of OCD, some of the characteristics of OCD such as the emotional, behavioural and cognitive characteristics, and we're going to evaluate the biological approach to OCD. How reliable is it as a way of explaining this disorder? Now, OCD often gets a humorous treatment in the media, but if you have severe OCD, this can be devastating to your life. So OCD consists of obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are the cognitive component, and to some extent the emotional. So an obsession in this context is intrusive thoughts, images, impulses that you do not conjure up. These can be inappropriate, or they can make you feel awkward or disgust. They may be sexual in nature, and as a result, these cause anxiety. They may also cause you to feel sort of moral repugnance because you don't want to think about these things. We've all had that moment, haven't we, where something's popped into our head and we've just thought, ooh, why am I thinking of that? Well, imagine that on a sort of daily basis. The anxiety that's caused by the intrusion of these images and ideas and thoughts is due to the lack of control that we have. So you can't actually control these ideas or the conjuring of them up in your own brain, and that causes us anxiety. Whenever we lose control or we're frustrated, it tends to cause anxiety. The anxiety tends to be blown out of proportion and is disproportionate to the situation. But this can make carrying out everyday tasks quite difficult. So that represents the obsessions angle. When we talk about the compulsions then, this is the behavioural elements. These are the bits we see. We see them behaving in this way. Can consist of irresistible, repetitive physical or mental actions. So you might have to think something over and over again, or a set number of times. You may have to perform an action repetitively for a set number of times. The people feel compelled, like they don't have a choice. There's often a set of rigid rules, and breaching these rules means often you have to go back to square one. People with OCD are well aware often that they have the disorder, and they don't like it. They don't want it, but they can't control it. And often they fear dreadful consequences if they don't go through with the compulsion. And these are irrational and dislocated from the particular activity, but they may be such as, if I walk over cracks, my sister will die, so I have to avoid cracks. We know it's irrational, they know often it's irrational, but if you have that thought in your head, it's difficult to avoid it. And performing the behaviour, the compulsion actually relieves to a mild level the anxiety generated by the obsessions. So these two drive each other in some sort of, bizarre reward-based feedback loop, where to avoid the negative experience of obsessions, we carry out the compulsive behaviours in a sort of negative reinforcement fashion. So it's a very complex disorder, and it can be very debilitating. My personal experience with this was a friend that I grew up with, I've mentioned many times. He had schizophrenia and he had OCD as well. And when he started off, I would say OCD developed long before his schizophrenia, and he would have an issue with locking his door. So he would go into his bedroom, he had a key lock, he would put the key in, he would lock it, open, lock, open a set number of times. What was interesting about it is if he hit the keys when he let go of it, or they were swinging too much, or he banged the handle, he would have to remove the key, put it back in and start again. Obsessive compulsive disorder. So there are different types of compulsions. there are checking behaviours, and there are cleaning behaviours. There are a number of others, but these are two very distinct categories that we can identify. So checking, an example, going back to my friend, he would have to go down and check that the stove was off. So he had a gas cooker, and he would go and check that he had switched off if he was cooking late at night. He would go up to his bedroom, he would then panic that he hadn't actually switched off, or maybe he'd accidentally hit the knob on the way out and that turned it back on. He would then go down and switch it off. He would go up and then start to think, I need to check it. And these obsessions drove him to go back down, check, and those are the compulsions. The other type of compulsion is cleaning. Now, you may know people who are obsessively clean. You have to be careful. Just because someone cleans a lot doesn't mean they have OCD. Some people are just very hygienic, or they like cleaning. The OCD sufferer is someone who fears contamination. So they're the sorts of people that if they touch something that they perceive to be dirty, they will have to wash their hands immediately. And it's often repetitive as well. When they do things like cleaning a room, they'll do it in a ritualistic manner. Another type of compulsion that you often see as well is eating behaviours, and this can be linked to eating disorders to some extent. And again, just because you do this doesn't mean that you have OCD, but often what people with OCD will do is they will divide their plate. Perhaps they'll put all the green stuff and separate it out, and the meat and whatever you may have to separate out by colour or by type. And they may have an order that they have to eat the food in, or they won't, or they can't do it or can't enjoy it. So they're just some examples of types of compulsions that people with OCD have to put up with and engage in. Right. So checking, cleaning, pictures. Obsessions versus compulsions. Well, because they're separate, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, could you have one without the other? Well, most of you probably have had obsessions. I would argue that many of us obsess about things. I, vividly remember if I make a mistake in class or something like that, that haunts me for a long while, and I will obsess over that. Or if I think I've upset someone, I'll tend to obsess over it a little bit. But can you have just one or the other? Well, Wilner argues that 69% of patients with OCD have obsessions and compulsions. They have both. But only 6% have just compulsions. So it is possible just to have compulsions. 25% have obsessions, and that makes sense. If obsessions drive compulsions, that means you may still suffer from this obsessiveness, but not have to carry out rituals. You may be able to control that impulse. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about the prefrontal cortex and structures within that. So, what are the primary explanations of OCD? Number one, OCD is a biological disorder. This is one theory, that it is inherited genetically. In the population at large, we find a rate of about 2 to 3% of the population have OCD. So quite high, actually. If you take in 65 million people, chances are there's a couple of people you know who have it. To varying degrees, it is a spectrum disorder. Carey and Gottsman found that monozygotic twins, if one twin had it, the other twin had it in 87% of cases, compared with 47% for dizygotic twins. So remember that monozygotic twins are identical, these guys here, and dizygotic twins are fraternal twins, non-identical. Just to recap what we mean by concordance rate, it basically means the presence of the same trait in both twins. So if one twin's got it and the other twin's got it, what is the rate of that in a population? In this case, 87%. So we would say that is a very high concordance rate. However, it's not 100%. If it was 100%, you could put it down purely to genetics. Because it isn't, we have to suggest that there's probably an environmental contribution. Specific genes then. Who are the culprits? Well, researchers tended to focus on two particular genes. One is the COMP gene, and this is linked to the regulation of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Now, dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. Specifically, it's released when we anticipate rewards. Now that's interesting because if you think about the person with OCD, their obsession is driving a compulsion. Why do they fulfill that compulsion? Because they expect a reward, you could argue. And therefore we can see how dopamine might be implicated in this system. So dysfunction of the dopamine system could lead to this constant anticipation of reward for generally non-rewarding activities like turning the cooker off. The link here between a gene is not that the gene itself has any function. The gene obviously has a function in coding for proteins, but the gene would be linked to, in this case, the regulation of a neurotransmitter. So talking about COMT is your genetic basis. People have this particular variation. However, which results in high levels of dopamine, which again, as we were saying, like that, you anticipate rewards where there shouldn't normally be rewards, like fulfilling compulsions. But really, the behavior is being caused in the obsessions largely from a neurological point of view. So just remember that the dopamine element is neurological, whereas the possession of a particular gene is genetic. This research there's a lot of modern research, but this actually we can trace back to Olds, and we've talked about Olds before actually, who showed that when we implanted electrodes into the hypothalamus of rats, that they self-stimulate continuously. And then they slept and they woke up and self-stimulated again. This sort of compulsive stimulation, like they couldn't stop themselves, you could argue is linked to the sort of dysfunctional reward system, which the hypothalamus is part of. Interestingly, let's link this to addiction. So what is one of the things that addicts have? They're shooting up heroin. Why can't they stop? Just walk away from the needle. Because they're compelled. It's a very similar idea. And actually, they're obsessed. So when a drug addict is not under the influence of their particular drug, let's say heroin, for example, so they are not currently intoxicated, they're thinking about how can I get the drug? Where can I get the drug? And it's constantly on their minds. And they feel compelled once they have the drug to actually take it. So, very similar links to things like from obsessive compulsiveness to addiction to all sorts of things like that. Another contender for explanation is the SERT gene. So this is also known as the 5-HTT gene. It causes lower levels of serotonin. We know that serotonin overall has a rather calming effect on the nervous system and on synaptic transmission generally. However, lower levels of serotonin mean that someone's base neural activity will likely be higher. You're lacking some of that calming, inhibiting effect that having normal levels of serotonin would produce. And actually that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You've got this obsession, constant thoughts, intrusive thoughts. Normalize the serotonin levels and maybe that calms it a bit. So those are the two contenders. Genes that affect neurotransmitters that affect thoughts and behavior. We've talked about this already, so I'm not going to go into detail, but you could talk about this purely from a neurological point of view without actually mentioning the genetics. So the question could ask you specifically about genetics, or it could ask you about neural explanations. Both explanations would probably talk about neurotransmitters, but a neural explanation wouldn't necessarily need to talk about genetics. Though, it's reasonable if you did. So we talked about genes like SERT and COMT code for proteins, which affect some of the neurotransmitters levels. Alternate levels can affect behaviour. Low levels of serotonin has been linked. High levels of dopamine. Cool, let's move on. So one aspect is neurochemistry. Neural explanation would be how these neurotransmitters are, what are the levels like, how they facilitate a normal neural functioning, cognitive functioning. Neuroanatomy is about the physical structure of the brain and activity within it. So as a neuroanatomical or another neural explanation, we can look at the functioning of particular areas. Idiot. So another neural explanation is if we look at the specific activity in different areas of the brain and whether or not it's functioning normally. So we're coming up from the cellular level of the neuron to the region in the brain and looking at how that functions. Now, there's going to be a lot of interesting links here that we can connect to, but one region that has been implicated in possibly the cause or at least associated with OCD is the orbitofrontal cortex. So the orbitofrontal cortex is this region just down here, as you can see highlighted in red. Now you know that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher brain functioning, a lot about social functioning as well, stuff like our moral reasoning, our ability to control our impulses and things like that. So, dysfunction in this area can result in conversion of sensations to action. So, another function is that when we sense something in this region, normally it's translated, the information is registered, and our decision-making apparatus come into play and we decide the course of action. Dysfunction in this area suggests that stimulus automatically triggers an action or is converted into an action. That would explain why someone who has an obsession feels compelled to act on that without really thinking about it or choosing rather than thinking. Now there's an interesting little link here to Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, as you know, was a railroad worker who had a railroad spike driven through his skull. Miraculously he survived, but the area of his brain that was damaged was the prefrontal cortex, but specifically the orbitofrontal cortex. Now, one of the things that happened to Phineas when he, after the accident, was his personality changed. Specifically, he became foul-mouthed and antisocial. He struggled to hold down a job, and he went on the road and did a variety of different activities. Now, one of the issues with Phineas Gage, we can argue, was his ability to regulate and control his own impulses. So he became impulsive. And we see this in a lot of criminals, actually. Adrian Rain talks about this in The Anatomy of Violence, that this area of the prefrontal cortex is actually responsible for inhibiting us. And in serial killers, in a number of impulsive serial killers, there is very little activity going on. And as a result, they do not control their impulses, they just behave. So the orbitofrontal cortex, we could see might have some link as well to impulse control. Another area is the basal ganglia, and we'll see this in a second. It's not really very visible from that diagram. So the basal ganglia is responsible for coordination and movement. Max found that dislocating basal ganglia from the frontal cortex led to OCD-like symptoms. So again, if we just code something and the behaviour that we observe is similar, we might be able to implicate it. Now, just have a look at the basal ganglia here. There are these purple structures just there. They actually link onto the amygdala as well. So we've got a nice little link here between, there's centre of our emotions, and an emotional component such as anxiety is present. And fear of the consequence, remember, they have this feeling that someone will just die. All of this, you can see, could act as a plausible explanation for OCD. Right, that has been a huge amount of information, a whistle-stop tour. Let's evaluate it then. So, there's a lot of empirical evidence to back this up. Biological explanations generally, we have family studies, we have twin studies. However, remember, with the twin studies, even the monozygotic, the concordance rates are below 100%. So we can't conclusively say that it is only genetics. There is an environmental component as well. The monozygotic twins may share similar experiences, much more similar than fraternal twins might. So if you think like people that have identical twins, they dress them the same. They may, everyone may respond to them the same in a way that they wouldn't necessarily with fraternal twins. So you can't rule out that their similarities in OCD could be due partly or to a greater degree to the environment that they share, which would be more similar. So that's an issue. Another one is reductionism. You are breaking down this complex set of behaviours to the dysfunctioning of one area of the brain, or the levels of dopamine or serotonin in your brain. This is ignoring huge elements of our experience, such as the environment that we grow up in, how people respond to us, our own thoughts and actions. So it's a very reductionist, biologically reductionist approach. Try to be specific with this stuff, don't just say reductionism. This would suggest a more suitable explanation would be a diathesis stress approach, which says that yes, you have a biological propensity to develop OCD, but you need the right, or in this case wrong, environmental conditions to trigger it. Now, the fact that it can be treated with a biological intervention, namely SSRIs, suggests that a biological explanation is a valid one, or at least an appropriate one. And the fact that by increasing serotonin levels using SSRIs, this suggests that serotonin has some role in it. However, with all drug therapies, essentially you are treating the symptoms and not the illness itself, or in this case the disorder. So, to summarise, there is more detail in your guide notes, make sure you've read those, but OCD consists of obsessions and compulsions. There is evidence of a genetic link, but it's not 100%. There are two genes that are fingered at the moment, SERT and COMP. Regulation of serotonin and dopamine have also been suggested as responsible, and they are linked to these two genes here. Neurological structures within the brain and their functioning has also been highlighted, specifically the basal ganglia and the orbitofrontal cortex. As always, if you have any questions, leave a comment, email me. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I will see you around.